It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of reason, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of knowledge, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. With those words, why Charles Dickens began his great novel, The Tale of Two Cities. It was the story of the Revolution. It was the story of the French Revolution, the second of the great revolutionary movements that swept the world, beginning in the 18th century and persisting until this very day. In fact, recently, when the president gave his inauguration speech, President Bush gave his inauguration speech in 2005, he referred to the fire in the minds of men. And to really understand what he's talking about, you have to understand this book. It was actually written by James H. Billington, who was in charge of the Smithsonian Institute, today as the Librarian of Congress. Now, James H. Billington is a brilliant historian, a brilliant scholar, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He would oppose many of the things I believe, and I would oppose many of the things he believes, and yet I think he's one of the greatest historians of modern times. And in the book, Fire in the Minds of Men, he talks about the World Revolution and points out that most people believe that the World Revolutionary movement that began with the French Revolution had something to do with the Enlightenment and the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau. And of course, that is simply a cover story to keep people from understanding what this is really all about. And as James H. Billington points out, the revolutionary movement didn't begin with Voltaire and Rousseau. It began when the aristocrats of Europe began taking the lighted candles from the religious altars and began putting them onto the altars of occult organizations, because this whole world revolutionary movement has its foundation in the occult. And he simply goes into the background of all the various secret societies and mystical societies and occult organizations that existed at the time of the American and French revolutions and continue to exist until this very day. Now, the one thing Mr. Billington doesn't do is of course, admit that any of this happened or spread to America, but it really did. I know that he knows that because we have information we'd gotten from his office that verifies the facts that he knows that many of these organizations had an influence in America, these secret occultic organizations. So, with that as a background, let me simply point out that it was Daniel Webster who said, "There is nothing as powerful as truth, and often nothing so strange." It was Lord Byron who wrote, "'Tis strange but true, for truth is always strange, stranger than fiction." And I would point out that most people who think they know what's going on in the world today are totally mistaken. And the great tragedy is we have been deceived. We've been deceived by a small group of men that control the media, that control many of our great corporations, that control our great tax-exempt foundations, that control our universities, and ultimately control what most people think and believe, which really isn't true. Now, let me give you several examples. One would be the fact that most Americans believe America is a democracy, after all. We've been told that. We're told that by our leaders. We're told that in school. We're told that by people on television. But it really isn't true. We don't pledge allegiance to this country. The Pledge of Allegiance doesn't say we pledge allegiance to the democracy for which our nation stands. No, America is a republic. It always has been a republic. And there's all the difference between a republic and a democracy is between a day and night. Because a democracy is ruled by man, a republic is ruled by law. You can read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and never see any mention of the word democracy other than to warn against democracy and say, we don't want a democracy. In fact, James Madison, in the 10th of the Federalist Papers, mentioned that democracies are spectacles of turbulence and contention, are incompatible with personal liberty and the rights of private property, and are usually as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths. That's the 10th of the Federalist Papers. They don't teach that in school. Why? Because the people who control our educational system really want us to believe that whatever our leaders want to do, they can, whereas, of course, we are a republic. Our legislators and our president and our courts are bound down by laws. And unfortunately, those laws have been simply put aside They have taken the chains off of government, and they're beginning to forge them for our people. It was Thomas Jefferson who said so well, "In matters of politics speak not to be of confidence in men, but bind them down from mischief with the chains of the Constitution." Those who would advocate a democracy, of course, intend to enslave our people. And I would like to suggest that this is going on today, and this is what the world revolution is all about. First America, and then the world. Well, let me give you another example of what is going on today, where most people really have a totally false idea of what's happening. Most people think the United States won the Cold War. Do you really believe that communism is dead? Well, if that's really true, why is it that Gorbachev occupies the United States? He has offices here in the United States, that many of the great leaders of our country, men like George Herbert Walker Bush and George Shultz and James Baker III, either attend his meetings or sit on the boards of his foundation. Why would they be subservient to Gorbachev? Why has Gorbachev given perhaps thousands, sometimes $100,000 to give a talk at a university or to give a talk to a private group? Do you really think he's worth that? Or is this simply a matter of paying off one of the most powerful men in the world today? Why do multi-billionaires like Maurice Strong and of course, Stephen Rockefeller, Professor Stephen Rockefeller, who is Nelson Rockefeller's son, work with Gorbachev? Why did they collaborate to write the Earth Charter, which is the new 10 Commandments for the world? Why is Gorbachev one of the most powerful men in the world today if we really defeated communism? If we defeated communism, why do 1.3 billion people live under communism in China today? Why is it that the media never refers to China as communist China, or North Korea as communist North Korea, or Vietnam as communist Vietnam, or Cuba as communist Cuba, or Zimbabwe as communist Zimbabwe, or Angola as communist Angola? Why is it that almost every one of the Commonwealth of Nations that came out of the breakup of the Soviet Union, almost every one of them is headed by a former communist, and the the KGB is still in control of both the military and of course the intelligence agencies over there? Is it perhaps that we've not been really told the truth? Well, if you read my book, the Brotherhood of Darkness, and this is really, I believe, a very, very important book, you go into the background of the documentation that we have here, why you'll find out that from the very inception of communism, it was financed by American financiers and by the Federal Reserve System and the American government, as well as people working within the English government. And we go into the background of the initial aid that was given back in 1918 by the Hoover Commission. Remember, President Herbert Hoover, at that time, of course, he wasn't the president. This was immediately following the First World War, when, of course, there was tremendous starvation, not only in Europe, but in Russia as well. The country was in the midst of a revolution. And so what did the United States do? Why, we sent massive aid to the communists, but not to the anti-communists. 97% of the aid we sent to the starving people in Russia went to the regions controlled by the communists. And you can find that in Herbert Hoover's memoirs, and we can document that for any of you who really doubt what I'm saying. And we have, of course, the book, The British Agent, written by Bruce Lockhart, who was actually sent to Leningrad, or to what was Leningrad later, as a representative of Lord Milner, who was one of the members of a secret society, very closely affiliated with the secret societies in the United States. And in the book, British Agent Bruce Lockhart tells how Lenin would always consult with and of course with a representative of the Federal Reserve System before he made any major decisions. If you've read Professor Sutton's work, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, or Professor Sutton's work entitled The Best Enemies Money Could Buy, or his trilogy, which is published by the Hoover Institute, Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, you'll find that we financed communism from its very inception and gave it technology and gave it aid and protected it because, of course, it was the best enemy money could buy. In fact, Professor Sutton wrote a book by that title, and I have a video interview with Professor Sutton. It's called The Best Enemy Money Could Buy. And if you have not yet seen that video, let me suggest you get it. It's available through my ministry. My interview with Professor Sutton, The Best Enemies Money Could Buy. You see, well, Plato wrote about that back many hundred years before Christ was born, between 300 and 400 years before Christ was born, when he wrote in the Republic, when the tyrant has defeated the enemy by conquest or treaty, and there is nothing to fear, why then he is always drumming up another enemy to rally the people behind him, so the people will need a leader. And let me give you the exact quotation on that, because I think it's so vitally important that you understand. When the tyrant has disposed of foreign enemies by conquest or treaty, and there is nothing to fear from them, then he's always stirring up some war or other in order that the people may require a leader. Something very similar was said by a gentleman named Mr. Lincoln Bloom some years ago in a study that was financed by our American State Department titled A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And Mr. Bloom said this: if the communist dynamic was greatly abated, the West might lose whatever incentive it has for world government. If the communist dynamic was greatly abated, the West might lose whatever incentive it has for world government. Now, the real purpose of everything going on today is to bring about a new world order and a new world religion. And if we didn't have an enemy, would the American people be willing to spend all the taxes that we do? For a massive defense department, we spend more money for defense in the United States than the next 20 nations of the world all put together. In other words, if they took the combined defense expenditures for Germany and England and Russia and China and the top 20 nations of the world and put it all together, the United States spends more money. And what are we really doing with that defense? Why we're developing techniques to watch the American people, to monitor the American people, to collect dossiers on the American people. And if you doubt the Defense Department is keeping dossiers on the American people, let me suggest a book written by General William Odom, who used to head the NSA. The book was called Fixing Intelligence. And in the year 2003, he wrote the book Fixing Intelligence, in which he really can't tell you what's going on because he's sworn to secrecy and he signed all these agreements not to tell people what's going on. But in that book, he did ask questions like, should the CIA be carrying out assassinations? Should the CIA have people planted in the media as journalists or journalists planted in the media? Should the Defense Department be collecting dossiers on American citizens? You wonder what we're doing with all the money? Well, a lot of it's going into satellites so that we can monitor people. A lot of it's going into intelligence agencies so they can listen to people's telephone calls with echelon by computers. They can read their emails. They can read their faxes. The United States is monitoring everyone in the world today as we move towards a new world order and towards a new world religion. Well, with this as a background, I wanted to get into the study of what happened in communist Cuba because, of course, most people really don't understand that the United States government brought Fidel Castro to power. Now, of course, when we say something like that, people are really just, why that could not be true. The American government couldn't have brought Fidel Castro to power. But let me ask the question, why is it that the United States Coast Guard routinely intercepts people who are trying to escape from communist Cuba today and captures them and sends them back to Cuba where they'll be imprisoned and tortured? Why do we do something like that? Why did President Clinton send Elian Gonzalez back to Fidel Castro and to build up his posture with the people of Cuba? Because after all, giving the impression that no one will be allowed to escape from Cuba. Why, we have the impression, of course, that there's this great struggle between the communists and the capitalists. And yet, of course, if you read this book by David Rockefeller, his memoirs, you'll find out that David Rockefeller had private meetings with Fidel Castro. In fact, David Rockefeller's two daughters are both Marxists. And he talks about it, how they were actually supporters of Fidel Castro. Why were the daughters of one of the most wealthy men in the entire world? Because the Rockefellers represent probably tens of trillions, if not $100 trillion in investments throughout the world. Certainly if you believe that Bill Gates and of course, Warren Buffett, the most wealthy people in the world. You've been reading too many financial magazines. Why these people are pikers compared to the Rockefellers, and the Rockefeller interests, really headed by David Rockefeller, are the most powerful economic force in America today, certainly, and paralleling probably the Rothschilds in Europe. So why would Dr. David Rockefeller be holding private meetings with Fidel Castro at the Council on Foreign Relations and elsewhere at his estate back in 1995? I thought that communists and capitalists were great enemies, and I would like to suggest that most of what you think you believe is just not true. Now, most people really don't know the history of Cuba, and so I thought maybe I'd give you a little of the background of it, because, I didn't know the history of Cuba until I began preparing for this talk. And you're going to see in this talk an interview that I filmed many years ago with Ambassador E.T. Smith, who was a multi-billionaire, and I actually got a film crew back in 1980, hired an airplane, took that film crew down to Palm Beach, Florida, and I went to Ambassador Smith's home, and we recorded the interview you're going to see in a few minutes, where he will tell you how the United States State Department brought Fidel Castro to power. You probably believe that Fidel Castro won the revolution, and nothing could be further from the truth. Fidel Castro never won a major battle. He did not have the support of the Cuban people behind him. Fidel Castro was created by the American State Department, who put an arms embargo on Batista's government, President Batista's government. And most of you do not know that President Batista was actually elected legally in 1954 to be president of Cuba. Actually, he had been elected several times before that. But he was elected in 1954 in a fair election with international observers, and the American government set out to destabilize Cuba by destroying their economy, by withholding the ability of President Batista to buy weapons in the United States, by doing everything they could to embarrass his administration. At the same time, they were actively helping Fidel Castro, allowing him to get weapons and money and personnel from the United States. But then you're never going to hear that story because of the degree of control that exists today over the American media and ultimately over what the American people think. Well, let me just simply go into a little bit of the background of Cuba. Of course, most of you will remember that there was the Spanish-American War in 1898. And, of course, out of that war, why America began its march towards world empire. And we captured the Philippines, and we captured Cuba and many of the other Spanish possessions. And, of course, Cuba was really an American protectorate until 1902, when it was given a measure of freedom, but, of course, was still maintained, America remained the right, or maintained the right to actually move into the country at any time, and to intervene politically if we didn't like what was happening. Well, of course, the communists were active in the Caribbean in those years. Probably most Americans don't understand that there was a great communist movement in the 1930s. There was a communist revolution in Mexico in the 30s, and of course the communists really took over and created a one-party government in Mexico that has existed for almost 50 years. There was simply no opposition to that one-party movement in Cuba. And really, actually, and of course, it wasn't until Mr. Fox came along that there was any real opposition to the one-party system that was established back in the 1930s. And it is because of the communist influence in Mexico that Leon Trotsky fled to Mexico when he was driven out of Russia, and of course it was there in Mexico, where Trotsky was executed by a communist hitman, and of course the communist hitman was sent to prison for a short period of time, a brutal axe murder. He eventually was released and returned to Russia as a great hero. People do not understand the communist influence throughout the world. Well, in the 1930s, there was a communist influence in Haiti. And so it was that in 1933, and it looked like the communists were going to take over, why three sergeants staged a bloodless coup. And they had the people behind them because the people didn't want communism. The people in Russia don't want communism. The people in Mexico, of course, hate what goes on there. The people in North Korea don't want communism. The people of Vietnam don't want communism. The people of Russia don't want communism. But it has been thrust on them by outside influences. And so it was in 1933, there was a bloodless revolution. It was known as the Sergeant's Revolution, and Batista was actually made the chief executive of the country. And in 1934, with the full support of the United States, because they supported Batista at that time, and of course there was an element in our government that did not want Cuba to go communist. Why the United States in 1934 gave Cuba its sovereignty, and no longer then did we have the right officially to intervene, although of course there was the Monroe Doctrine, which of course gave us tacit ability to intervene. Today the Monroe Doctrine is dead, but at least until recent years, most Americans thought that we had a right of choice to keep foreign influence out of the Western Hemisphere. So Batista then ruled until 1940. At that time, they held a democratic election. He was elected president of Cuba. And under his regime, Cuba began to prosper. Batista was voted out of office in 1944, and he left office. He actually moved to Florida and lived there in exile. And, of course, the new regime came in. By 1952, things were pretty chaotic. The man who was in power was stealing money right and left. It's estimated he stole $140 million. There was increasing chaos. There was increasing communist activity. And it was in 1948 that two significant things happened. First of all, some of the men who supported Batista when he was the president, in 1948, they asked Batista to run for Senate. He was living in Florida. He wasn't interested in running. He really wanted to get out of politics. But they put his name in, and of course, he won the election. He won election, and he became a senator in the Senate in Cuba. And so he returned to Cuba. But in October of 1948, there was a revolution in Bogota, Colombia, at the Pan American Conference that was held there, and many American representatives from our State Department were there. And the local radio station was seized by a young man named Fidel Castro. He was 22 years old at the time. He went on the radio and said, "This is a communist revolution. I am Fidel Castro from Cuba." There was no question in 1948 that our State Department knew Fidel Castro was a communist. And yet, of course, as the story unfolds, and as you'll hear Ambassador Smith telling you later in this program, why we brought Fidel Castro to power in Cuba, knowing full well he was a communist. So what happened then? Of course, by 1952, things were pretty chaotic in Cuba, and it was basically Batista was asked again to actually by the army, because they were afraid there was going to be a revolution. He was actually asked to lead another bloodless coup, and of course he did lead another bloodless coup. But in 1954, they actually had an election that was witnessed by people throughout the world, and Batista won the election in 1954. He was elected by the Cuban people. Now, of course, it was that same year that Fidel Castro and a group of revolutionaries in Cuba attacked a barracks in Santiago. Fidel Castro was captured, and of course, he was put into prison. Batista, of course, had no death penalty in Cuba. Batista really was a very benevolent, both president and as he acted outside of the law as a dictator. He released Fidel Castro. He released many of the revolutionaries back in 1955, once he had been inaugurated as the president legally. And it was at that time, of course, that Fidel Castro went to Mexico and began planning his return. And then, of course, in December of 1956, Fidel Castro returned to Cuba. And, of course, the original attack on the barracks in Santiago was the 26th of July. And that was in 1956. 1954. Anyway, that's where they got the name, the 26th of July movement. So in December of 1956, Fidel Castro brings men ashore in Orient province. He has probably 150 men, all but 15 are killed. Fidel escapes, moves into the Sierra Madre, and of course, he's got to get publicity somehow. In fact, the government had announced that Fidel Castro was killed in the invasion. Fidel has got to get publicity. So the New York Times, which is part of this establishment, that really controls what the American people think. The New York Times sent a reporter named Herbert Matthews to the Sierra Madre in Cuba to interview Fidel Castro. And Herbert Matthews comes back and begins writing articles for the New York Times, equating Fidel Castro with Robin Hood, equating him with Abraham Lincoln, and calling Fidel Castro the Abraham Lincoln of Cuba, and the man who's going to, of course, free the serfs and bring this wonderful prosperity. Now, Herbert Matthews had to know Fidel Castro was a communist. I mean, his brother was a communist. Che Guevara was his major lieutenant. But, of course, Fidel Castro had already announced that he was working with the communists back in 1948 at the uprising in Bogota, Colombia, and our State Department knew that. And our State Department coordinated with the New York Times and with the newspapers all across America to glorify Fidel Castro and his rise to power. Well, of course, it was the following year that Ambassador Smith was actually asked to become the American ambassador to Cuba. And, of course, when he was taken to the State Department, who do you think that they called in to actually give him the background of what was going on in Cuba? Herbert Matthews. Why wouldn't they get somebody from the State Department to brief the American ambassador? No, they brought in a reporter from the New York Times who had equated Fidel Castro with Robin Hood and with Abraham Lincoln. And then, of course, one of the interesting things that certainly Ambassador Smith is very careful in the book he wrote entitled The Fourth Floor. The book is entitled The Fourth Floor, and even in my interviews with Ambassador Smith, he's very careful not to impugn the president, not to impugn the Secretary of State. The president was Eisenhower. The Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. Both of those were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. John Foster Dulles was a treacherous man. He was certainly one of the protégés of Edward Mandell House, who's one of the most wicked men in the world, and primarily responsible for bringing communism to Russia. And we tell that story in my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. But Colonel Edward Mandell House was in my opinion, was deeply involved in the occult. We verify that in my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. He was part of these secret societies and secret movements, and his protege in 1957 was a man named John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, who pretended he didn't know what was going on, but Ambassador Smith told me he sent many directives directly to the Secretary of State and directly to the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, telling them Fidel Castro was a communist. Now, he didn't tell me that on film, but he told me that off film, and I believe he was telling the truth. But he didn't want to be critical. Ambassador Smith was a very kind, a very dignified, very brilliant man. Unfortunately, he was simply a pawn in the game. But he was also, of course, had the opportunity to interview an Ambassador Hill, who was ambassador, I think it was to Cuba or one of the other Latin American countries, before Ambassador Smith went to Cuba. And Ambassador Hill told him, he said, be careful. Be careful because you are being sent to Cuba to preside over the fall of Batista. I mean, you are being sent there because they're going to topple, they intend to topple Batista's government. Just be careful for your family. Be careful for your own personal safety. Don't leave the embassy. Stay close in there because your life could be in jeopardy. This is in essence what he was told. And of course, Ambassador Smith tells that story on page 119 of his book, The Fourth Floor. And of course, so Ambassador Smith goes to Cuba. And he meets Batista, and Batista's a brilliant individual. I mean, Cuba's prospering. Cuba has the highest economy of any country in the Caribbean. In fact, the highest economy of literally any country in South or Central America. Cuba is prospering under Batista's rule. Now, admittedly, at times he was suspending the rights of the people, which is, of course, what he had done in January of 1957, because of the revolutionary activity there, and it was the only way he could bring things under control. And he actually had to suspend, that was actually January of 1958, and he had to suspend constitutional guarantees on a number of occasions to try to put down the revolutionaries. But, well, what are we doing in the United States today with the Patriot Act? Aren't we suspending the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment in the name of fighting the terrorists, the wicked Islamic terrorists? The only trouble is, if you read the Patriot Act, there's not one word in it about Islamic terrorism. In fact, if you read the Patriot Act, it really is all about regulating the American people and restricting their rights. Not one word about terrorism, Islamic terrorism. They've simply redefined terrorism as anybody who wants to change our form of government. And I would like to suggest that it is the people within the secret societies who are the true terrorists, the people who want to change our form of government from the constitutional republic we are, or we were, to the democracy we have become. Well, Ambassador Smith gets to Cuba, and he finds this tremendous turmoil. There certainly are efforts to have a revolution. There's a naval uprising in September of 1957. Doesn't get very far. And Batista is really able to control things very well because he has the Air Force behind him. He has the military behind him. He has the police behind him. But sometimes his police become overzealous. If there are demonstrations and there are riots and there's killing, why sometimes they treat people very harshly. But haven't we seen that sometimes in America when there have been demonstrations here and the police are running through the streets with their helmets on and their shields and the tear gas and the batons and beating people with batons? And I don't excuse what happened in Cuba. I don't excuse what happens in America. But so many of the demonstrations are staged to provoke a response from the police. They're staged here in the United States. They were staged in Cuba. Certainly after the Rodney King riots, we declared martial law in Los Angeles. Why did we do that? Because you had to do that to restore law and order, and this is what Batista did. He established martial law in January of 1958 for 45 days, and then, of course, he said he would do away with the martial law. He would restore constitutional guarantees. But, of course, then the revolutionaries would do everything they could, once constitutional guarantees and freedom of the press and freedom of movement were restored, to destabilize the country. And, of course, what happened was the United States government cut off all military supplies for Batista. They didn't cut off military supplies which were coming from the United States to Castro. They simply cut off the supplies that were coming from the United States to Batista. There were 1,950 Garand rifles he had bought and paid for. They wouldn't send them to them. There were armored cars, 20 armored cars he had bought and paid for. They wouldn't send them. They wouldn't send him any of the spare parts he needed for his military equipment. They wouldn't pay him for 10 training planes that he had actually bought and paid for. And then they made this public. And everything they could do to embarrass his government, our State Department did. They worked to destabilize the economy of Cuba and to put out false reports about the chaos that was there. And there were chaos in certain parts, but most of the time things were entirely safe. In fact, at one time, there was going to be a baseball team that was coming from Buffalo to play in Cuba, and they read all these reports in the American media about how unstable things were, and the Buffalo baseball team was afraid to come, and Ambassador Smith intervened and said, look, if children are out playing in the streets, why should grown men be afraid to come and play a baseball game? But most of what was put out in the media was a lie. And most people didn't understand that the United States was doing everything they could to block President Batista from getting weapons anywhere in the world, just exactly as we had done 10 years previously with General Chiang Kai-shek, as we toppled his government and brought the communists to power in China. Oh, you didn't know we brought communism to power in China? Well, you need to read the reports that were written after the fall of China, and many of those are actually included in my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. That's Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to get it and read the reports of the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security of how the United States brought communism to China exactly as we brought communism to Cuba, exactly as we brought the Sandinista to power in Nicaragua, exactly as we brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power in Iran in 1979. And as we brought the communists to power in Rhodesia in the mid-'70s, when we brought Zimbabwe to power. And what happened? Why we put arms embargoes on these countries so they couldn't buy weapons anywhere in the world. And we did everything we could to destabilize them psychologically and economically. And that's exactly what we did in Cuba in the period of 1957 and 1958. And the fact that you don't know that, and you haven't ever heard that, is simply a reflection of the degree of control that exists today over what the American people think. Well, certainly as time goes by and things are getting worse and worse in Cuba, there is to be an election in the November of 1958. For a president, and of course Batista is not going to run again. His party is running a candidate. There are other candidates that are running. And, of course, everything is done to destabilize the election, but international observers are brought in. The election is fair, and Batista's man wins the election. Now, the Catholic Church recognized that the situation was unstable, and they've repeatedly tried, of course, to get a ceasefire and then to put in a provisional government, and Batista would have gone for a provisional government. In other words, people totally impartial to take over control of the government. And the United States State Department said, oh, we couldn't support that. We don't want to intervene. And as Ambassador Smith will tell you in the interview you're about to see, we intervened again and again and again. All we did was intervene on one side, and it was pro-Fidel Castro. But you see, the American people didn't understand that. We were intent upon bringing Fidel Castro to power. Why? Well, I think Plato said it best when he said, when the tyrant has defeated his enemies by treaty or conquest and there's no foreign threat, why then, of course, he's always out drumming up another enemy so he can rally the people behind him. That's how you control the people, by having an enemy. And this whole idea that we mentioned earlier, that if the threat of communism was to abate, why we would lose one of the greatest impetuses towards this movement towards world government. So if you understand that, you can begin to understand so much of what's happened. And time and again, why the Catholic Church and representatives of the Catholic Church tried to set up a provisional government. Batista would have gone along with it. Other groups wanted to set up a provisional government. None of this would work without the United States support. And the United States refused to accept any other alternative other than Fidel Castro coming to power. Now, eventually Ambassador Smith was ordered by the State Department to go to see Batista, the president of a sovereign country, and tell him he would leave the country. Within 24 hours, he was instructed he was going to have to leave the country, and Batista did leave on January 1st of the year 1959. Chaos broke out across the country. Within 4 days, there was looting and vandalism and rape. And then, of course, Fidel Castro came in, took over control of the country, and began his mass executions. There was no death penalty in Cuba under Batista. In fact, he had a very benign type of government. When Fidel Castro was actually arrested back in 1953 after his attack on the military barracks in Santiago, he was sent to the Isle of Pines, and he had his own studio, he had a car, he had a driver, he had all the books, he could write whatever he wanted to. Well, of course, under Fidel Castro, that became a center of torture, and some of the atrocities that were done there, doing electric shock on people when they were awake, creating madness, driving people mad. Fidel Castro executed between 10 and 15,000 people with the smiling and benevolent support of the American State Department, and the average American has no idea of what really transpired. Well, you are going to hear Ambassador Smith tell his amazing story. This was shot back in 1980. The quality of the film may not be as good as we'd like it to be, but it is the only, to my knowledge, the only interview that was ever done with Ambassador Smith, where he tells you how the American State Department brought Fidel Castro to power. Now, you say, but what about the Bay of Pigs? Didn't we try to overthrow Fidel Castro with the Bay of Pigs? Well, no, we really didn't. It was simply a charade. I had the unique opportunity at one time, it was back in the late 1960s or maybe 1970, of meeting a military officer who was at the Pentagon, the war room at the Pentagon, when the Bay of Pigs was carried out. And he told me that the area, the Bay of Pigs, was not the primary place where they were going to put the men ashore. In fact, it was the one place you could put the men ashore where you could be sure they would lose. Why? Because it was surrounded by an impenetrable thicket. There was no way off the beach, absolutely no way, except up one road, and right up that road were between 5,000 and 10,000 Cuban troops in training. And, of course, within a day or two, they had 50,000 troops there on the Bay of Pigs, simply killing off the people. We sent them in, and we did not send any air support, which we'd promised. We didn't send the supplies they'd promised. I have a book on the Bay of Pigs, and, you know, I don't know how many of you know anything about outboard motors, but they're incredibly reliable. You get the Evinrude or Johnson outboard motors. And so these were brand new outboard motors they had on boats that were going into the beach, and the propellers would fall off of them. The engines wouldn't start. How could you run a situation this poorly, unintentionally? The planes were set to go to wipe out Fidel Castro's Air Force, but they weren't allowed to go. Now, we're told John Kennedy was responsible. I don't think so. I think it was probably McGeorge Bundy, who, of course, was a member of Skull and Bones, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was instrumental in getting us into Vietnam, who was one of the most wicked men, in my estimation, that we have had in a position of power in the United States. And of course, those men were sent into the Bay of Pigs not to succeed, but to die. The major that I talked to told me that everyone in the war room went out and got drunk that night because they knew the invasion was going to fail. And this has been the same story all along. Oh, the CIA wanted to, of course, kill Fidel Castro. How were they going to kill him? Why, they were going to give him an explosive cigar to embarrass him. They were going to put powder in his shoes that would make his beard fall out so he would be ridiculed. Do you mean to tell me that the CIA that hired assassins, that has been able to be involved, we know, in the assassination and murder of Patrice Lumumba and Mr. Diem and Mr. New and President Trujillo in the Caribbean, and leaders all throughout the world, and those of you who haven't read the new book we're carrying called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, goes into how they killed the president of Ecuador and how the CIA killed the president of Panama. And have you ever noticed how many world leaders die in plane or helicopter crashes, whereas, of course, we're told that this is really the safest means of travel? These are assassinations, ladies and gentlemen. And you mean to tell me that the CIA was unable to get somebody to kill Fidel Castro? We saw that they got somebody to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, why Jack Ruby walked right into the police station in Dallas, Texas, and gunned down Lee Harvey Oswald when he was surrounded by police officers. But the CIA is incapable of getting anybody to kill Fidel Castro over 40 years. They have to give you the impression they want to get rid of Fidel Castro, but they don't. And then if you read David Rockefeller's memoirs, you'll find that in 1945, David Rockefeller, two of whose daughters became Marxist. Two of David Rockefeller's daughters became Marxist? Communist sympathizers, supporters of Fidel Castro. David Rockefeller will tell you his daughter made frequent trips to Cuba and was a supporter of Fidel Castro. And yet, of course, David Rockefeller was private meeting with Fidel Castro in 1995, but I bet you didn't read that in your newspapers. And of course, you're not supposed to understand that most of what you think you know just is not true. Well, I do hope that after you've seen the interview, my interview, filmed in 1980 with Ambassador Earl T. Smith, will help you to better understand why the revolution continues, and that most of what the American people think they believe really is not so. Ambassador Smith was a financier and corporate director. He held appointments from 3 presidents of the United States. During the years 1957 to 1959, he was the American ambassador to Cuba during that tragic time of the Cuban Revolution when Fidel Castro came to power. Ambassador Smith, can you give me the background of your initial briefing from the State Department before going to Cuba in 1957?
I was briefed in Washington for a period of 6 weeks, and during that time I was asked to make an appointment with Herbert Matthews of the New York Times so that he could brief me. I think this is of special importance because the fact I don't believe any other American ambassador has ever been briefed by a newspaper correspondent regarding the country to which he was to be appointed to. And it was known at the time that, of course, that Herbert Matthews was a strong proponent of Fidel Castro, and that Fidel Castro was dedicated to the overthrow of the government of Cuba by force.
Now, were you given any inkling of the communist background of Fidel Castro?
I was given plenty of inkling. No, I want to change that. No, I was not. In all the time that I was in Washington, I don't ever recall the State Department saying a good word about Batista, and I don't ever recall them saying a bad word about Fidel Castro.
But did the State Department know about the communist infiltration of Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement?
Oh, I think so. I think it was known from the time of the Bogotazo, which took place in Bogota in 1948. I think the CIA, and the FBI, and also the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs and the head of the Caribbean Division were both in Bogota at the time, on active duty for the State Department.
So they knew about the communist infiltration, but they didn't relay this information to you?
Well, that is correct.
What about Mr. William Wieland and Roy Rubottom, who were both in the State Department? What was their background as far as the Bogota uprising, and what part did they play in the bringing of Fidel Castro to power?
Well, as I recall, Rubottom acted as secretary for now we're going back quite a few years, but as I recall it, he was secretary of the mission that was down there and was representing the State Department at that time.
This was in Bogota at the time?
In Bogota at the time. It was called a Bogotazo because one of the leaders of the uprising was Fidel Castro himself.
And was this a communist uprising?
Yes, it was always maintained to be a communist uprising. And not a communist uprising, but an uprising which was led by the communists and instigated by the communists.
Now, what part did Mr. Wieland and Mr. Rubottom play in the ultimate fall of Cuba in 1959?
Well, Mr. Rubottom and Mr. Wieland were really the top men of what I call the fourth floor. And the fourth floor is a book, and I wrote a book with that name. It must be taken symbolically. It means where the Latin American officers had their desks in the State Department because they were situated on the fourth floor. And Mr. Wieland and Mr. Rubottom were the leaders of the fourth floor. They were the top men. Mr. Rubottom was Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, and Mr. Wieland was the head of the Caribbean Division. And they influenced our actions in Cuba by their day-by-day actions. And they were instrumental in doing everything that they could to see that Fidel Castro was removed from office.
That Fidel Castro was removed from office?
Yeah,
or
not
Batista?
excuse me, Batista was removed from office. I think we'll have to redo that one.
All right. Well, did the State Department actively work to bring Fidel Castro to power?
The State Department actively worked through the day-by-day actions of the men who were situated on the fourth floor. They were the people connected with the Caribbean and all of Latin America. The Secretary of State was completely preoccupied with Berlin and Tokyo and Moscow, so that he left everything to the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, who was Mr. Rubottom.
Did Mr. Wieland and Roy Rubottom, who were from the American State Department, know about the communist influence within Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement?
I don't think that Mr. Rubottom and Mr. Wieland knew that Fidel Castro was a communist, but I do think that they were familiar with the fact of his communist activities as a boy, from the fact that he was an active leader in the uprising in Bogota in April of 1948. At that time, I believe that Fidel Castro was only 22 years of age, and there's no question about it that he was an unstable youth.
And what happened at the Bogota uprising in 1948?
Well, the Bogota uprising was a communist-inspired uprising for the overthrow of Gaitan, I think his name was, G-A-I-T-A-N. And it was a communist-inspired uprising which Fidel Castro led the youth end of it, and it is very famous in history.
I see. What did the American State Department do to undermine Batista's position and aid the revolutionary movement of Fidel Castro?
That was done in the day-by-day actions of those on the fourth floor, and the fourth floor must be taken symbolically. That word represents where the officers of the Latin American officers had their desks in the State Department. And in their day-by-day actions, they did everything they could, it seemed to me, to undermine Batista and to help Castro.
So what specific things did they do to undermine Batista?
Well, there were about 20 that I've listed, and as I'll give them to you as they come to mind, if you want me to.
All right, please do.
We'll say one of the main things that was done was when they stopped the shipment of arms in 1958, in March of 1958. Under the MAG program, the United States government was supplying arms to Central America and to Latin America. That is for hemisphere defense. There were 1,980 Garland rifles that were to be shipped, and the Fidel Castro group, the 26th of July movement in Washington, were able to persuade the State Department officials that they should cancel that shipment of arms. Now, the actual loss of the arms did not mean so much to the Batista, but it was the psychological effect which had hurt the morale of the people around him and the army officers and his generals. On the other hand, it was a great psychological uplift to the Castro people because they knew that Batista had lost the support of the United States government.
Well, now then, was Batista able to buy weapons from other countries, or did we?
Yes, he got his weapons from the Dominican Republic, from Trujillo, who was the dictator at that time in Ciudad Trujillo. And also, the United States asked other countries not to sell arms to Batista. This is really intervention by innuendo.
What about other military equipment that he needed? Was he able to get other specific things? What about parts for his military vehicles?
No, they also stopped the shipment of parts, airplanes. We'd sold 15 airplanes, and Batista paid for them, and the State Department canceled it. I call it reneging on a deal, and the excuse was that they could use those planes for bombing the revolutionaries, where they were just plain ordinary training planes. Also, the same thing took place with armored cars. We sold them 20 armored cars, and Batista paid for them, and we never delivered those, due to the pressure which was put on the State Department by the members of the 26th of July movement. And they had their representatives in Washington. They had a legal representative, and we were also dealing with other emissaries.
Now, what about Fidel Castro? Where was he getting his weapons?
Fidel Castro was receiving his weapons, a great many of them, from the United States. They were financed by Prio, who was the former president of Cuba, and they were sending planes, landing money, bodies, and rifles, and they were dropping them into Sierra Maestra.
But weren't there laws? Weren't there American laws to prevent this?
Yes, there were laws, but the laws were violated, and we did not. We winked at them.
Well, now it was my understanding.
Well, the State Department winked at them.
It was my understanding that President Batista asked that this be stopped, and that were certain actions taken by our government to stop the shipment of arms from America to Fidel Castro?
Yes, they did take certain actions. Dr. Prio was arrested, and put in jail, but he was only there for a short period of time. And he was placed in jail and arrested because he'd broken our rules, our laws about helping revolutionaries for the overthrow of the government of Cuba. And in return for which Batista promised, and he did, renewed constitutional guarantees and lifted censorship on the press. This was done 3 times while I was ambassador to Cuba. When I say 3 times, on 3 different occasions, the president of Cuba.
Mr. William Wieland and Roy Rubottom were high officials in the American State Department. Did they have any knowledge of the communist influence within Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement?
William Wieland was in charge of the Caribbean Division, and he served directly under Mr. Roy Rubottom, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs. And they were fully informed of everything that was going on through the Latin American desk and through what I call the 4th floor, which is symbolically represents where the desk officers who represent Latin America were situated. Now, it's a fact that Mr. Rubottom was in Bogota at the time of the Bogotazo in 1948, and he served as secretary to the 9th International Conference, and he was a delegate there. And that is what Fidel Castro was trying to overthrow. And he was about 22 years of age, and he led the communist uprising, attempting to overthrow the delegation.
And that was in Bogota, Colombia?
And that was in Bogota, Colombia.
All right, sir. Now, do you feel that the mass media in America, the newspapers, television, radio stations, gave the American public an accurate appraisal, an accurate picture of what was actually happening in Cuba?
No, I don't think they did. The bearded boys were good copy. Therefore, they seized upon the opportunity. Also, it was the overthrow of a rightist dictator, which they are also dedicated to, many of the media. And so they pictured Fidel Castro as a political Robin Hood, and actually likened him to Abraham Lincoln, many of the press, which was giving a false impression to a young revolutionary who was completely unstable, always had been. When I went to Cuba, I went down very carefully after I'd been there for a month, went through all the police records, went very carefully into his background. And I discussed with many people over there who were not in favor of Batista and also not in favor of Castro, but they knew that Castro would be worse for Cuba than Batista. And Father Kelly, who was the head of Villanova University, told me that when Castro attended his university, he had an accident on a motorbike and was unconscious for a long time, and he doesn't believe that he ever was completely sane after that accident.
And yet this was the man that our State Department seemed to want to bring to power.
Yes, this is the man that our State Department did want to bring into power.
Now, do you think that the New York Times was fair and impartial in its reporting of what transpired?
Well, the New York Times was really responsible for bringing Herbert Matthews back to life and giving him the stature that he had. Shortly after the group of 81 men that came from Mexico and landed on the south coast of Oriente with Fidel Castro, which took place in December 1956, Fulgencio Batista released word that Fidel Castro was dead. So the people in Cuba thought he was dead. They paid no attention to him. By gunboats and by Cuban soldiers who met the expeditionary force, most of them were killed. I think there were only 12 men left with Fidel Castro at that time. Fidel Castro knew that this would have to be corrected. So he contacted the New York Times office in Havana and asked that a reporter be sent out to interview him. This would prove that he was dead, and he would also get a chance for an interview. The New York Times received a request from Ruby Hart Phillips, who was the head of the New York Times office in Havana, that they send down a correspondent. They sent down Herbert Matthews. Herbert Matthews spent, I believe, 2 days and 1 night, had his picture taken. The picture appeared on the front page of the New York Times. This all came out in February 1957, and they printed 3 front-page articles that appeared on a Saturday and a Sunday and a Monday, which likened Fidel Castro to Abraham Lincoln and spoke of him as being a political Robin Hood. Those articles gave Fidel Castro stature all over the world and made it easier for him to get money and support. And of course the rest of the press picked it up because it was good copy, as I said a few minutes ago.
Well, now, were there other alternatives to Fidel Castro? In other words, were there other groups within Cuba that we could have supported and brought a democratic society to Cuba, a free democratic society?
There were other people opposed to Batista, in addition to the 26th of July movement, which was led by Fidel Castro, and in addition to the Directorio Revolucionario, which was a communist group in Havana. They were what I call the legal opposition. They were lawyers, they were good business, they were businessmen, and they were the ones who thought that Batista had outserved his usefulness, but they also realized that Castro would be worse for Cuba than Batista. So they did not support Fidel Castro or the 26th of July movement. And I'm naming such people as Mario Lazo, who was the author of Dagger in the Heart. He was the outstanding lawyer of the firm of Lazo with Cubas in Havana. Guillermo Belt, who was the former ambassador to the United States from Cuba. Father Kelly, the head of Villanova University, etc., etc.
Now, were there opportunities when we might have supported these people and brought about a free and democratic Cuba?
There were many times when there were viable solutions to the situation in Cuba without Batista and without Castro. The State Department never would support any of those solutions, always for the reason that they did not want to intervene in the foreign affairs of Cuba. Whereas I've shown in my book and pointed out where we intervene every day, positively and negatively and by innuendo. The viable solutions that I mentioned, when the State Department would not support any of them, it was very difficult for me to go ahead. However, the papal nuncio told me that he would carry the ball and would go ahead and work on these solutions. However, he would have to have our support, and without our support, he could not go on. So, in other words, the Catholic Church was prepared to go ahead.
Ambassador, what were the viable solutions to Fidel Castro taking over?
Well, there were a number of them, but they're based around the premise that Batista would appoint a provisional government without Castro, and that the papal nuncio would carry the ball. He would talk to Batista and would arrange for it, and then Batista would leave the country, and we'd have a provisional government. But this provisional government would have to be recognized by the United States and would have to receive arms so that they could carry on. Now, the United States at no time, or I would rather say the State Department at no time would do this or would follow through, because they believed that it would be intervening in the foreign affairs of Cuba, which after all by that time it was beside the point, because we've been intervening continuously, positively and negatively by innuendo. Now, if we had done this, when you set up a provisional government, then it would have been necessary for us to see that we had honest elections, and that would require landing troops or doing whatever was necessary. Otherwise, we do what we have done here in Latin America and in various places, where we get rid of a rightist dictator and we leave a vacuum for the communists to step in. Had we been willing to support a provisional government, Dr. Marcus Sterling was willing to go on and was willing to be the head of it and only stay in office if he were elected for 6 months and then step down and call for new elections. But you can't just appoint a provisional government and not do anything to support them. You have to maybe land troops, you have to supply arms, and you have to maintain that government in force and to see that elections are honest.
Now, were you instructed by the State Department to tell Batista that he had to leave?
On December 17, 1958, upon instructions of the Defense Department, I went out to Cuquini, which is his place outside of Havana, and told him, it took me 2 hours and 35 minutes to tell him that we no longer believed he had effective control and that the United States would look with disfavor upon his remaining perpetually in Cuba. In other words, it took me 2 hours and 35 minutes for me to tell the chief of state to leave his own country and to step down. I also had to tell him that he would not be welcome in the United States, that his family would be, but that we couldn't let him come because we were afraid of the troubles that it would create from the political asylees that were there from Cuba.
I'm going to ask that question over again, if I may. Were you instructed by the American State Department to notify Batista that he must leave his country?
Yes, I was instructed by the State Department to notify Batista that he would have to step down. And it took me 2 hours and 35 minutes to do so. But I must explain this. It wasn't all done in one day. I received communications which went through private sources that were, nobody in the State Department knew what was sent because it did not go over the regular coded messages. It went through CIA connections. And I had various conversations with Gonzalo Guell, who was both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, and we discussed it together. And of course, after every talk we had, he would notify the President, and I would send a duplicate report, a complete report of full conversations what I had with Dr. Guell. And then finally, on the final day, when I went up to see the President, he knew beforehand what I was going to say because he had been informed by Dr. Guell, the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. But it still took me 2 hours and 35 minutes to get the point across, because I spent a great deal of time pointing out that we appreciated what a great friend he had been to the United States. Any matters that came up before the United Nations, not only did Cuba support us, but the President of Cuba went out of his way to line up other Central American nations and other Latin American nations to support us. And the ambassador from Cuba, Dr. Porcio Nuendo, was a valuable friend of the United States. I pointed out all these things. I pointed out the fact that he'd helped us in World War II, that he had been a loyal friend of the United States. However, we felt that he lost effective control and that it would be in the best interest if he left Cuba.
But at that point, was there any other alternative than Fidel Castro?
There had been, for 6 months prior to that, numerous viable alternatives without Castro and without Batista. And I never could receive any support from the State Department. And and when I say I believe they were viable, the Papal Nuncio believed they were viable, and I believed they were viable, and he was ready to carry on with them because he knew that I could not obtain the green light from the State Department.
But at the point where you went to Batista and told him he was going to have to leave, was there any other alternative at that point other than Fidel Castro taking over?
Well, but that's, if he left, it was just Fidel Castro who was going to take over.
Pure and simple.
Pure and simple.
All right, sir.
And there was no compromise. There was nothing with Fidel Castro. Nobody could control Fidel Castro. Many of the emissaries from the 26th of July movement that were crowding the corridors of the State Department always believed and told our people on the fourth floor that they would be able to control Fidel Castro, that he was a youth who was irresponsible, but that they would be able to control him after he took over. Now, the proof of that they couldn't control him was when Dr. Guillermo Belt, who was the former ambassador to the United States from Cuba, came to me one day and said the strike which is going to take place on the 1st of April of 1958 will not be a success. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, because the mayor of, not the mayor, but the leader of the revolutionary movement in Havana sent word to Fidel Castro that when the revolution was a success, that they would take over in Havana, and they would appoint the mayor and would take over. Fidel Castro sent word back to them, nobody's going to take over but me. Whereupon they sent back word and said, all right, if you feel that way about it, we will not take part in the strike. And of course, if they didn't take part in the strike wouldn't be successful in Havana, and then it wouldn't be successful throughout the country. This is how we knew, or at least how I knew, that there was no controlling of Fidel Castro. He was going to run the show all by himself.
And once Castro did come to power, did we promptly recognize him? Did we support him?
Yes, we recognized him. I think we recognized him too soon. The policy of the United States had always been that we did not recognize any country that had had a revolution. We did not want to be the first. We did not want to be the last, but we wanted to be in between somewhere. And the United States policy had always been that we want to assure ourselves that they would honor international obligations which had been incurred by the previous administration, and that the new government would not be communist dominated. We did not wait for any of these. Fidel Castro came into Havana on the 1st of January, and I recognized him and gave him his papers of recognition. I think it was either about the 6th of January, maybe it was the 7th of January. It would have been sooner. I was asked to come to Washington so that they could give me the papers, send me back, and I refused to go. That was on the 3rd of January until all Americans had left Cuba. I wasn't going to leave Cuba and take a seat on an airplane or a place on a ship that some American could get out until. I wasn't going to leave until it was ready. And when I told him that it was clear now from my point of view to come up, then I flew up. And that was on the 6th of January.
Do you see any parallel between what happened in Cuba and what has recently happened in Nicaragua?
Yes, I believe that Nicaragua is Cuba all over again. Exactly the same things. We are responsible for the removal of Somoza, the same as we were responsible for the removal of Batista. We would not support Somoza. We would not give him arms. We shut off the arms going in there, and we winked at the arms going in to the Sandinistas, but we wouldn't support him. And it actually, some people have said that we didn't support Castro even after he got out. We did. We went right on with the subsidy on the exporting of American sugar, which had been done actually since the days of Roosevelt. We continued it through all the regimes there, and we continued to do it with Fidel Castro. And the same support went to the Sandinistas.
And is there a communist influence within the Sandinista movement?
Well, yes. Thomas Borgay, who is the chief security officer and in charge of the police, is a self-proclaimed Marxist. They have a junta there of 5, of which 2 are Marxists. They claim that 3 are conservatives, but there's no proof of that. And all we have to do now is look at the record is what's happened there.
Why do you feel our State Department wanted to topple Batista and bring Fidel Castro to power when he did have a leftist leaning, when there was communist infiltration of his movement?
Well, first of all, we don't have a foreign policy. As ambassador to a foreign country, the United States ambassador, I was never told what our foreign policy was. I don't believe we have one. The only policy that I can assure you that we've had so far is for the overthrow of all rightist dictators who are friendly to the United States and anti-communists. And then when we do overthrow them, we aren't prepared to go in and set up elections to see that they're honest. We step out, and that's when the communists step in.
It seems that we always oppose the rightist dictators and we support the leftist dictators. Is there any reason for this?
Well, the only reason I can give is that they believe a leftist dictator is more progressive.
And by progressive, you mean socialistically inclined?
Oh, yes.
Ambassador, why is it that we always seem to be opposing rightist dictatorships, whereas we always seem to be supporting leftist dictatorships?
Well, the only answer I can give you to that is because they consider leftist dictators as being progressive.
But certainly aren't they totalitarian?
Say that again.
Certainly aren't these leftist dictatorships just as totalitarian? In fact, many times much more totalitarian and much more ruthless than the rightist dictatorships?
They're worse. All you've got to do is take Stalin, for example, and what goes on in Russia.
All right, sir. What do you think is the future of Central America?
Well, the present future, it would appear that we've lost Panama. At least I believe Panama is going to be communist. Nicaragua is. Nicaragua is Cuba all over again. El Salvador was overthrown, and there's a military government there now, but it would appear that the communists are going to take over in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. Costa Rica's already in their hands. And then it is possible that they will move on up into Mexico and Venezuela because of the oil.
I see. I'm going to ask that.
Now this is, and what are we going to do about it? Nothing. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. Our actions have indicated that.
I'm going to ask that again. What, in your opinion, is the future of Central America today?
It would appear that Central America is going to be under the communist control, and I see a very bad future. Nicaragua has already gone communist, and then we're going to have El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica.
What about Panama?
The same pattern is going on. Well, the Panama Canal, the American Canal in Panama was surrendered to the Panamanian government, which is under the control of Castro and the communists.
What about islands in the Caribbean?
And the islands of the Caribbean, that's also. On the last chapter of my book, which I wrote in 1962, I said that we must be prepared to do something and stop. Otherwise, eventually we will have a red lake. The Caribbean will become a red lake. In Grenada, they moved in. In Jamaica, it's practically communist. Guyana is communist. Of course, Cuba is communist. So they're closing in on us from all sides. Not only is the Monroe Doctrine dead by our actions, but it's about time that we stood in there and reinforced it.
Now,
reenacted it.
Could Fidel Castro have taken power in Cuba without the active support of the American State Department?
No, Fidel Castro, of course, could not have taken over in Cuba without the support of the fourth floor.
What, in your opinion, is the future of America if we continue following the same foreign and domestic policies that we've followed for the past 20 years?
Add one thing, without the support of the fourth floor and the press in the United States.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with Ambassador Smith. And I hope that you'll want to get copies of this, or even copy this video that we have, and get it out to other people, because we need to get the information out. America is locked in a deadly struggle for its very survival. There are two groups of people in America. There are the good people, many of them coming from a Christian perspective, and then there are the evil people, and you can trace the origin of this movement back to the time when the Pilgrims came over, or shortly thereafter, back in 1620. There have always been the two forces, one, of course, altruistic and idealistic, wanting a better world for everyone, the other coming from the occult, from the Rosicrucians, from the Masons, from the secret societies, hoping that America would become the new Atlantis and would lead this country, indeed the whole world, into the New World Order and the New World Religion. We're told we're involved in a war on terrorism today. Those terrible terrorists were really in a constant threat of terrorism, and yet, how many terrorist attacks have there been in the United States? How many car bombings have there been in the United States? You mean to tell me, with our borders open, that they can't get one terrorist into this country to blow up a car and create havoc in this America? And I would like to suggest, once again, that most of what we believe is not true. If there is really a great threat of Islamic terrorism in the United States, why has the Bush administration done everything they could to block efforts to arm the pilots on our planes? And there are about 100,000 pilots. They put every impediment in the way to prevent the pilots from either wanting to become armed or for getting trained so they can be armed to protect the people on the plane. Why is it the Bush administration has marshals own only a very small number of planes, and all of those marshals are required to carry a dress code, and you can walk through the first class compartment on any plane and tell exactly who the marshals are? If there is really a threat of Islamic terrorism, why is it that the airlines are not allowed to profile Middle Easterners when the plane? If we're really in the middle of a war with Islamic terrorists, I would think that they would not be doing what they're doing. In other words, profiling little old ladies, or attractive young women to be patted down and humiliated. You would think that they would want to go ahead and profile Islamic people. In fact, you would think that people, if I was a Mohammedan flying on a plane, I would want to be targeted. I would want them to target people because I wouldn't want some Islamic terrorist blowing a plane I was on. If there was really a threat of Islamic terrorism, wouldn't you think that they would have installed on every commercial airliner protection so that we could protect our planes in case there was a surface-to-air missile. All you would need would be one surface-to-air missile hitting one American airliner, and you destroy the entire American airline industry. In fact, but everything has been done to block that. Wouldn't you think if there was really a war on terrorism, we would have tried to seal our borders with Mexico, so that the Islamic terrorists couldn't come into this country, and of course disrupt our train traffic? It's very easy to derail a plane, a train on a track out in the middle of the desert, but it hasn't happened. Why do you think that is? We're told our intelligence agencies were just so incompetent, they had no idea what was going to happen on 9/11. Well, if they were incompetent at that time, are they more competent now that they've been able to stop all these attacks? And the truth of the matter is they haven't, because there haven't been anybody who's really been trying to do it. They could blow up our chemical plants, but they're not doing that. They could blow up certainly many of our nuclear facilities if they really wanted to. They could disrupt our electric lines, but none of this is happening because the war on terrorism is not really a war on terrorism. It is a war on the freedom of the American people. And once you begin to understand that, then so much of what's going on today begins to make sense. Well, I hope that you will very carefully consider what you've heard today. I hope you'll want to check out the facts. I hope you'll want to get the various books I've referred to, specifically my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, Ambassador Smith's book, The Fourth Floor. It's out of print, but I'm sure you can get a copy from a library or perhaps from some organization that still has that book. In fact, if we get enough demand, I will get and be able to carry copies of the book, The Fourth Floor. And then, of course, help us to get the truth out across America while there's still a time. And understand we're involved in a spiritual battle for the souls of mankind and the survival of Western civilization. And remember those words: back at all that foes have plotted, back of all that saints have planned, back of the schemes of men and devils, there's a higher hidden hand. Warp and woof our heaven created, every pattern good and wise, oft confusing by earthly standards, but good and wise in heavenly eyes. Though the cause of evil prospers, yet his truth alone is strong. Though our portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong. But that scaffold sways the future, for in the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. Goodbye, and God bless you.
Mountains